Good afternoon. I figured when they put the extra Apple segment next to me, I'd probably end up with absolutely nobody, but thank you for entertaining me. I'm giving two talks over the next two segments. The first one is, generally speaking, what is IHE and what have they done broadly from the perspective of FHIR. The second one is going into depth into some of the more popular profiles that IHE has using FHIR. So just to give you a landscape for what the two are. This first slide deck is actually, you'll get access to all these slide decks, so please, if I go too fast, recognize you'll get them anyways. It has way too much in it for 45 minutes. I did this very slide deck at HL7, took me 3 hours. So what I kind of want to first find out from you guys is, what is it that you came here for? Is this generally you're interested in what is IHE as a general organization? How does it relate to HL7? Or do you already know about IHE and you want to hear more about what IHE is doing with FHIR? So mostly the second. Okay, I'll hit the first a little bit. I'll go through that as quick as I can, because that's kind of the breakdown that this first one is all about. Okay? So, I am John Moehrke. I am with Bylight Consulting. Right now I'm working with the Veterans Health Administration on the My Healthy Vet, which is the patient portal. Previously I was with GE Healthcare. I've been involved in HL7 and IHE and DICOM and even some of the ASTMs and ISOs for almost 20 years. So I'm happy to answer any question. Mainly what I'm going to kind of go through, I just kind of went through this a little bit. What is IHE? What is FHIR from IHE? Again, I'll go through quickly these first slides, so I'm going to skip through them a little bit. But this is predominantly just kind of showing that there is a relationship between IHE and HL7. Basically, we have similar goals, but we have different focuses. The HL7's goal is predominantly to produce standards that can be reused, just like DICOM. And IHE is there predominantly to constrain those for a given purpose. So that's kind of the main difference. They're similarly organized. IHE is organized into what's called domains, and they produce conformity assessments. They have connectathons 3 times a year. HL7 has work groups. They have conformity assessments. They have 3 FHIR connectathons now. The FHIR connectathons are somewhat being patterned after the IHE connectathons. They're not the same thing. They're rather complementary. And as both organizations mature, we're both looking to figure out where those two things happen, right? Both are international. IHE is international, IHE International. Both have national domains. Neither of them have a very good US domain. This is generally the IHE process. This basically takes a year, which is one of the drawbacks of IHE, is that everything has to, fall into an annual cycle. I'm not going to go into the depth because you are telling me you're mostly aware of what IHE is, and if you want me to explain it later, I'm happy to explain it later. Some of these life cycle things within IHE are looking to be changed, so if you're kind of frustrated, let me know and I'll help get that over to leadership as well. IHE, just like HL7, is accredited ANSI standards. So now we get into some little bit more, I'm going to start slowing down a little bit, profiles versus implementation guides. It's a key term you're going to have to understand. It's not going to get resolved. This is just fact of life. Within FHIR, they use the term profile for a very constrained purpose. It's the restrictions on a given resource. So what things are mandatory, what things are forbidden, a specific binding to a value set will create a structure definition that they call a profile. That's not inconsistent with what IHE does, but IHE is really taking a use case, picking from the standards that are available, constraining those standards for that given use case, which might include constraints and value sets, but it may also include creation of extensions. It may also include the creation of interrelationships with other standards. Over in HL7, that concept that I just described is an implementation guide. So there's a little mismatch of the terminology, but if you just, you're just going to have to somewhat understand that, because there is, I'm being told by the FHIR core team that the concept of a structure definition that's used to constrain a resource is too embedded for them to come up with another term. The other problem is they push back to me and say, hey, what term should we use, John? And I go, structure definition? But it's just a reality, and maybe it'll change, but when I'm speaking here, I'm wearing an IHE hat, so I will often say profile, and I actually mean the broader concept of taking a specific use case, finding the standards that would meet that use case, constraining it for that use case to enable interoperability. Does that make sense? Connectathon, I'll go through a little bit faster. Connectathons are events where implementers get together, across the table from each other, try to figure out why their stuff isn't talking to each other, and eventually at the end of the time period, they walk away going, wow, that was a lot of work, but I'd rather do it in front of the person in a friendly environment, engineer to engineer, than with the customer holding the back of my shirt saying, you said it would work. Okay, that's the idea of a connectathon. In that way, the IHE connectathon and the FHIR connectathon have the same intention. Unlike, though, the FHIR connectathons are far more ad hocs. They're far more testing of the specifications, testing of early implementations. They're far more guttural, if you will, and less formal, whereas IHEs are scripted. There is a known test tool that you have to test against. There is then partnerships that are set together for testing purposes, and you can walk away from an IHE connectathon far more sure that what you're going to deliver to your customer is the same thing that the guy across the table is going to, because you're both working with closer to production code. Now, I said these are gray areas, and you will absolutely see production code at a FHIR connectathon, and you will absolutely see prototype code at an IHE connectathon, but that's generally the differences between them. They're both intended to get engineer talking to engineer in a cooperative environment. Kind of already just covered that. So, again, still on the what is IHE, so I'm going to go a little faster. The IHE, does this profiling, basically this meta standard concept, if you will, the idea that it is a constraint upon an existing standard, and that's true across the board. IHE will not create its own standard. And I know some of you out there saying, wait, what about XDS? XDS is based on EB XML RIM. So it is not an invention of IHE, although it feels like it because the EB XML RIM is not a healthcare standard. So the community just doesn't understand that it's a standard that existed. But IHE, when we get to a point at which we cannot find a reasonable standard, IHE stops and goes and finds a standard that would develop it as a standard so that we can come back and profile it. That's one reason why it sometimes takes longer through the IHE process. Some terminology in IHE. Integration profile is the work that IHE produces. That is the standard. They're usually published as supplements to begin with. That's during the trial implementation phase. Trial implementation phase, you're very familiar with it if you're familiar with FHIR, in that there is a period under which these profiles are expected to be tried, and breaking changes might happen to them based on that trial. Once they go to final text, normative, they will get integrated into the technical framework. The supplements and the, should then no longer be used because they're now part of the technical framework. Unfortunately, they tend to still be used just because they're self-contained things and the technical frameworks are spread across volumes. And yes, IHE knows that this is a pain, but it takes us a while to fix a process. We're working on that. Integration statements are similar to conformance statements from HL7, except in the intention of IHE, an integration statement is intended to be a commitment by that vendor that I have tested and can be held accountable to be in conformant with this profile, this actor, with these options. So you as purchasers, if you're purchasers, you should be able to take the integration statement as a purchase specification and as a commitment to that purchase. And that's some of the early on differences that IHE was trying to make to the market space, in that they really wanted to say, here is not only a specification, but when somebody puts into an integration statement that they have implemented that specification, they can be held accountable to that. So it's very important that this is a circular system. If if hospitals or clinics don't hold vendors accountable, they'll continue to not be accountable. So it's this circular thing. Connectathons are supposed to be rather neutral. They're supposed to be, what happens here stays here kind of a thing. You're never supposed to talk negative about your peers. Hey, he didn't, they couldn't get it working all week. That's a no-no, because connectathons are intended to be a very cooperative, very productive, very successful. I'm not going to go too much into the process. I've kind of covered it. So I want to kind of get to more of what I think you guys came here for. Yeah, by the way, that's an integration statement. It's very simply profile, actor, and option. And by that triad, you know exactly what they are declaring they have supported. All right, so these are the IHE domains. The ones in red have written profiles today that use FHIR. So IT infrastructure, I'm a co-chair in IT infrastructure. I can talk about that all day long. Patient care coordination, that's where we get a lot of the CDA profiles in the past. We're getting a bunch of FHIR document profiles and some clinical profiles from there. Pharmacy has a couple. Quality research and public health have a couple. And radiology has one. We're going to go, the rest of this slide deck is going through each one of those to give you a little bit of a flavor of what are these things. Does that make sense? Is there any questions up until this point? Because at this point we dive into the second half. All right, so you all know what IHE is. Cool. All right. When IHE started into this pathway of doing things around FHIR, predominantly some of the big questions were, hey, we already have an answer for patient demographics query. The purpose of IHE is to limit the number of variances. Why would we create yet another variant of patient demographics query? That's rather opposite of the whole purpose of IHE. So the whole purpose of IHE is to take a use case and come up with the single best solution. So what at long discussions, we basically came up with this understanding that what's new is predominantly that there are these new environments that are, the internet environments, the mobile environments, the app environment, that very much struggles with HL7 v2 or HL7 v3. Not a real shocker. It's the same thing you've been hearing, here for sure. It's the same reason why FHIR existed, but basically we came up with this as the differentiator. So you'll see across all of these profiles, or at least most of these profiles, that the word mobile is used. The word mobile is not there to constrain it, to say, oh, don't use the PDQ for mobile on anything that's not mobile. If you want to use it on an X-ray device, big old iron that would have happily used HL7 v2 or v3, you can use it. But we're kind of saying the differentiator between the HL7 v2, the HL7 v3, and this FHIR one is predominantly it's because of the newer environment. So you'll see this mobile word used in the profile names. It's predominantly there to indicate this new environment that wants JSON, wants HTTP RESTful, doesn't want to deal with pipes and hats, doesn't want to deal with complex XML. This isn't too important to put up, but you can kind of see that IHE isn't just seen by one organization. It's actually got a lot of sponsors. So, first up is, of course, the domain that I am happiest to talk about and most knowledgeable. And that is the IT infrastructure. IT infrastructure is the domain within IHE whose purpose is to do things that are highly reusable across many of the domains. So this is somewhat of a special domain in that it's getting its requirements not only from outside, from healthcare providers and vendors, but also from inside. So radiology will come to us and say, come on, we need a X capability. So does pharmacy, so does PCC. Why not just do it once so that we have a reusable widget? So IT infrastructure tends to do reusable widgets that aren't necessarily always that obvious from a standalone. So within IT infrastructure, I've already kind of hinted that the patient demographics query is one of our mobile profiles. It was the first one we did. Yes, it's where we said, hey, we already have PDQ, which uses v2. We've already got PDQ v3 that uses HL7 v3. Just to fill out the family, we need a PDQ M. So we have PDQ M. We have, I'm going to go into a little bit deeper in the next, but so this is kind of the first one we did. We very quickly followed it by PIXM, and all of these We're very much in support of MHD, which will be the topic of the tutorial after this one. Since then, we filled in some of the other ones. And then we, of course, being IT infrastructure, we deal with the security, reusable security parts within IHE, ATNA, and all those kinds of things. So we created this internet user authentication. It's actually not a FHIR profile per se, but it deals with the access model that is typically HTTP RESTful. And it's very much complementary with Smart on FHIR. You'll see that when I get to that. So first up is mobile access to health documents. Come back in the next hour, I'll discuss this a little bit more, but essentially MHD is intended to be an API to an XDS environment, to an XCA environment, or even just a point-to-point push. So you don't have to use MHD with XDS, but some of the constraints that you'll find in MHD are because of some of the constraints in XDS. But as you can see on the very right-hand side, you can absolutely have just a document consumer that is retrieving information from a document responder read-only side. So you can use MHD even in just the consumer-oriented environment. So I guess I should go through a little bit of the details. So the first side is a publication side. Document source needs to publish a document or two. It will create a bundle which has a document manifest in it, and publish that to, in this case, the document recipient. You'll see on the next page how some of those things interact with XDS. The right-hand side is find submission sets, find document manifests in FHIR terms, find document entries, which is a document reference in FHIR terms, and retrieving a document itself. I was involved early on in FHIR, getting those resources put into FHIR in support of this kind of a use case. So I'm actually on both sides of this, being the author of the MHD profile, but also being the author of the resources within FHIR. So for those of you who know XDS, you kind of recognize XDS in the middle of this diagram. MHD just simply adds these little APIs at the ends, right? So using FHIR as an API to a backbone which is XDS based. You don't need to change the backbone, you just need to change the accessibility. Do you have one of these per health information exchange? Or do you have some N of these? That's a deployment problem. The system absolutely supports both. There's actually a similar diagram for XCA, so just imagine the right-hand side alone. So whether you're doing cross-community or you're doing XDS. All right. ATNA is another long-standing profile in IHE, audit trail, and node authentication. It is intended to deal with the security of any system, saying, hey, make sure that you don't talk to anybody that you haven't authenticated and isn't authorized to talk to you. That's the node authentication. There's a couple of flavors in there. One of them is very much the HTTPS that FHIR uses. The audit trail side of that is being enhanced in this particular supplement to use the audit event resource within FHIR to give access to the audit repositories records of all the audit events that have happened. So in this way, you now have a query interface to an ATNA audit repository. Again, the audit event within FHIR is intentionally designed to be consistent with the ATNA audit message. And I've been working both sides of that as well. So mobile alert communications management. Within IHE, there is the alert communications management profile. And there was a use case that says, hey, we need to be able to get an API into that environment from FHIR. So this one was written in ITI rather than PCD, where I think ACM is done. And this is just the how do I trigger an alert communications. And it's using the communications resource and the communication request resource. So in not very readable, down in the lower right-hand corner is the list of resources that are used by these, which gets a little bit more interesting as we go on. Within ITI, there is two different directories, provider directories, so to speak. There is the Care Services Direct Discovery, and there is the HPD, the Healthcare Provider Directory. This is let's combine them and create them as a FHIR profile. So MCSD is actually the combination of HPD and MCSD, given various options, so you don't have to implement everything, but it was just easier to do it once rather than having two rather similar models of provider directories and trying to coordinate between them. So again, this one is predominantly made up of profiling, organizations, locations, practitioners, and health services. Very similar to the provider directory that US Core is working towards. There are some consistent stakeholders involved in both organizations. Lots of trial implementation is necessary here and feedback from those trial. This is true of all of these FHIR profiles, but this one in particular I'm a little concerned about. But it's intended to allow you to search for organizations, locations, practitioners, and health services. So this mobile cross-enterprise document data element extraction is also part of the next hour's discussion. It's a profile of profiles. What it says is, given that document sharing exists, XDS exists, XCA exists, given that document sharing exists, and given that MHD has provided access to those documents, but it doesn't change the documents. So if it's a PDF, you'll get a PDF. If it's a CDA, you'll get a CDA. That's with MHD, you get what's put in there. MXDE says, hey, why can't we extract the data out of those, create a list, or create a normal API of the observations and the medications and the problems, and provide the linkage back to the document from whence they came. So this is actually a profile of profiles. It says take MHD, take QEDM, which you haven't heard about yet, and mix them together in a special mixture such that they work nicely together. And again, the next hour I'll get into a little bit more detail on that one. This is one that there isn't a different capability within IHE, although there's been plenty of discussion, and that is, hey, I have a non-patient file, a configuration file, a style sheet, a policy document, how do I publish them in a way that they can be discovered and the content pulled? So NPFS is for non-patient files, specifically. If it's a patient file, put it in XDS or MHD. But if it's a non-patient file, how do I gain access to them? It happens to use the document resource or document reference resource as well, in that it's just differentiated by, there's a different value set for types of these documents, and the patient element has to be empty. But it allows you now to publish rather easily your style sheets, publish your configuration files, publish, you know, all kinds of files that you need to publish. PDQM I've kind of talked about. It's basically the same use cases as PDQ. I need to be able to search on a patient given some kinds of demographics. This thing here doesn't even constrain the patient resource. It says, hey, any patient resource will do. You probably have your regional constraint anyways, so you know we're not going to constrain it. But it's just about as simple of a IHE profile as can be. But you have to be able to look up patients before you can use anything that's patient-centric. Again, that's why it's an infrastructure. PICSAM, again, followed the exact same use cases and the exact same constraints that PICS had. The unusual part here is that PICS constraint was that I don't know the demographics and I don't want to be exposed to the demographics. I have an identifier and I just simply want the equivalent identifier in this other domain. So in this case, we used an operation such that I can pass in any kind of an identifier, and I'll get back only the list of identifiers that have been mapped against that. Clearly, one of the identifiers is the URL to the patient resource, so I could go ahead and retrieve that, but I don't have to be exposed to those demographics. So it's kind of a unique one there. And, you know, again, trial implementation, so the question is, will this actually be necessary going forward? And then IUA is Internet User Authentication or access control. And again, it's just simply saying use OAuth. It's not really saying much more than that. It does go into the same list of elements that we did for XUA as far as attributes about the user. So what is the roles that they hold? What is the purpose of use that they're asserting? You know, so all of those elements that are XUA described in SAML, we've described how you would do those in the JSON. All right, so that was ITI. Any questions on ITI? Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so the question is there structure defined when you do the MHD queries, and how do you convert an MHD query into an XDS query? Yes, both of those are specified. Predominantly for the FHIR side of that, the MHD side, it's just use of the query parameters on the document reference resource. So there's a subset of the query parameters that are necessary in MHD. Not all of them are necessary to meet the MHD profile. And then how you convert those into XDS is also specified, kind of. We're getting some good trial implementation experience there. Probably. Yeah, well, he's asking if there's a link to these things. At the end of this presentation, there is the link to the IHE profile pages. And from those, you can get to all the specifications. Okay? Any other questions on ITI? All right. So, radiology. One of our oldest, well, the oldest domain. I don't think it's even arguable. They have created one FHIR profile called SOL, Standardized Operational Log of Events, and special mention to the presentation that you either went to or missed that Brad gave on the DICOM HTTP RESTful equivalents. So there is a whole imaging access model which is HTTP REST that isn't necessarily FHIR, but it's the same tooling. And now Brad can leave. He's only here to make sure I said that right. Yes. So if you have questions on that, go to Brad. So SOL is a very interesting one. This one's been actually waiting in the wings for a while. Remember I said earlier that IHE, if it can't find a standard for the use case, it will try to find a standard or get somebody to build a standard before it'll profile it. This one has been waiting for a couple of years before we realize now that the FHIR audit event can be used for this purpose. So in the SOL profile, they've defined a set of events that are interesting to track from a overall workflow efficiency perspective. When these events happen, the system that's aware of the event happening will record an audit event. So these are not security events, these are not privacy events, these are events along a workflow path so that you can do analytics on where is the bottlenecks in my workflow. That's it from radiology. Patient care coordination is the one that does most of our EHR-based ones. They have a laundry list. Some of these are in process, so I don't have a whole lot of details. Clinical mapping support is basically a terminology lookup profile. So it's predominantly using the, well, it's an operation. So it's looking to translate codes and provide mappings. There is some support for this more directly in the newer version of FHIR. So question on how this one goes forward. Dynamic care plan is a profile of care plan, predominantly to define how a care plan transitions through its life cycle. So it has quite a few interactions. You can see a lot of interactions. It's predominantly based around the care plan. It does use the subscription model so that the participants in a care plan get notified or can ask for a subscription, be notified when something happens in the care plan. And it also leverages the plan definitions, which the next profile, I think, no, maybe, actually no, that's the new update. So this thing has been just recently updated to not just be about care plans, but also around creating a library of potential patterns of care plans. So they're now using the plan definition to have this basically a library of potential care plans, so that when you're looking at your patient and say, oh, they need this kind of care, let's pull that pattern, create a care plan for this patient based on that pattern. So this is I would also say this has been somewhat of a joint work between HL7 and IHE. It's been tested probably more at the FHIR connectathon than it's been tested at the IHE connectathon yet. So, but it's very much based around how do we get a care plan to deal with multiple sites, multiple organizations, multiple actors, multiple participants. Obviously, if you have a care plan, you have to have a team. So this is talking about how do you keep the team together, and how do you support how the dynamics of that care team. Point of care medical device tracking is, I should have Todd explain this one. But this is intended to support various devices, pacemakers and the like. So it's the recording of the device relative to the patient it was associated with. And there is an equivalent of this. No, that's a different thing. Query for existing data. I spoke about this with the MXDE one, the document sharing. Query for existing data. We have a query for existing data profile. So this is the mobile one. So this is the one where we said the same use cases. How do I do them with FHIR? To anybody who looks at FHIR, this is going to be a rather academic profile. To anybody who's ever done Argonaut, this is basically Argonaut in an international specification. Except that it's international, so it doesn't have some of the U.S. centric parts. But this basically says there is a subset of FHIR resources to deal with the normal problems, allergies, meds, kind of stuff, immunizations. And so QEDM basically just says these are a subset, which is a useful priority subset versus the whole list of resources that you get from FHIR. And I said in the next hour, I'll talk through how you use this relative to a document sharing environment so that you can close the loop. The recon profile kind of builds upon that, saying, well, great, QED just simply says, give me all current allergies. But all current allergies may not actually be what you really want to know. What you really want to know is, what's the reconciled list of allergies? What's that subset of the allergies which someone has made sure is the most solid list? So what Recon does is it uses the list resource to say this is the reconciled allergies, this is the reconciled medications. So that's what Recon adds on top of QEDM. Remote patient monitoring. Oh, I think this is... You know what? I don't have a whole lot of detail on this. I think this might be one that's in development. Provides a means of reporting measurements taken by personal health devices. Yeah. It's in here. Brad?
I don't know much about it, but there is a link there.
Yeah, there is a link.
So it does exist.
Well, I made sure that unless it's showing the ones that I hid, because I know there were some that that were in the slide deck that weren't real.
Ask Melanie, who's at the devices table in the mezzanine.
There you go. Go upstairs. There's a device.
PCH Alliance.
So the RIPT is dealing with emergency transport. So how do I, as the transport system, inform the target hospital of the information about the patient that I'm transporting. This isn't about an emergency, it's about a transport. So there's a slightly different data set. This has two different modes. One is a CDA encoding, and the other one is a FHIR document. The FHIR document is being developed right now. This is emergency transport, so this is the, from the scene. Again, somewhat similar intent, but there's a difference in the patient and the data that would be expected. Again, there is a CDA form and there is a FHIR document form. So the pharmacy profiles, and yes, if you need to go, I only have a few more to go. I'll try to get through them. Pharmacy profile is mobile medications administration. So it's talking about how do I do meds admin within a captured environment. And it is intended to work with a normal med-admin. So it's intended to be an API to that. And then barcode processing. So this is intended to be able to read a barcode and then have a service convert the barcode into something usable so that you can then record that usable barcode. We have this last quality in research. They have 4 profiles. Mobile retrieve form for data capture is looking predominantly at just using HTTP forms. It does not use the questionnaire resource. I think that's probably a future improvement, but it is intended here to just kind of lay out the forms processing, rather similar to QED. Vital records and death reporting. So this is a profile on vital records and death reporting. Again, it supports a CDA in a way to encode that information, as well as a FHIR document. So you'll see from PCC, you're starting to get these profiles that are saying, here is a use case, and right now the CDA is implementable and usable, but FHIR is kind of on the horizon. And in almost all of these cases, the stakeholder organizations are asking for the CDA form because they know they can use that today, but they want to make sure that the FHIR form can come along with it. So in some cases, these are also informing the specification itself. And I think the last one is birth and fetal death reporting, rather similar to the vital. But again, what is the encoding? Quality outcomes. So these last 2 are in process, so there's absolutely no detail available. I think they're right now out for public comment. So if you're interested in the domain, I can help get you involved in public comment. And I think that is all I have. So we have 25 profiles. And actually, if you go to that top link, that is where IHE has a publication of all of the profiles that are FHIR-based. And the slide decks will be given to you somehow through whatever the system is. Otherwise, I can also help you get to this information. Okay? Thank you.